So while we set it up, I'll just ask the ones online, I just hope like you can think for a second, but the ones here, how many of you consider yourself have successfully created cultural change in your work? Okay, I see relatively confident hands just go saying, yeah, maybe. Like, all right, cool. Like, how many are still trying? Good. Then we're on board for the right ride. Okay, we can still hold for a little bit. So I think I'll just say for a second, like today, I wanted to talk a little bit more before we start talking about governance and culture. And then I just wanted to talk a bit more about the theme of the conference today, creating cultural change. And then starting thinking about what is change, what is culture, what are we creating, what do we mean when we talk about this? It all sounds very familiar. It's cultural, yes, we all know that, but what does that mean? So that's pretty much like what we're gonna talk about today. And I am up. That's really exciting. So hi everyone. If I can just get this thing to work, doesn't matter. So my name is Cancan Wang. I am an associate professor at the IT University of Copenhagen. I'm coming from this department called Business IT, but more importantly, I'm from this research group called REFlACT. So REFlACT stands for Reflections and Actions, and then as you can imagine, we are a group of researchers who hope to generate knowledge through engaging with so-called real-life practice. I do consider research as real life as well, but there you go. So for us, we really consider ourselves as change workers, like researchers as change workers, and I also see UX designers, like software developers, we are all change workers. So today my angle is really trying to talk from one change worker to the other change workers and talk about what it actually means to create cultural change. But then before we actually talk about what does it mean, like all these big words, I wanted to share a very small story about my teaching last year. So I teach this course called IT Globalization and Culture in our bachelor program called Global Business Informatics. Somebody, if you ever come across IT, you might have heard about it before. Otherwise, check it out. You probably don't need it, but if you have children. So last year in the course, so in this course, we talk about how actually IT and culture interplace and then how that shapes global collaboration. So last year, we had a panel discussing culture change with students. And on the panel, there are three speakers. One is a marketing specialist from a software company. One is a UX designer who runs their own company. And then the third one is a business broker who is in a change organization in Denmark who is trying to elevate sustainability initiatives. So we talked about for an hour about creating culture changes. And then at the end of it, I asked the students, do you have any questions for our speakers? It was all very quiet. And well, that happens. But then after about a minute, one of the students raised their hands very, very sneakily, just said, and then he asked, don't you have any example that shows we can actually change culture? So what actually happened is that 1 hour became an hour of venting practices about how ambitious we were when we started to talk about culture change, and then how many different kind of tools, smart tools that we have designed to initiate, to facilitate understanding, making sense, and then changing culture, but also how much we failed sometimes at creating culture change. But why is creating culture change so difficult? So I would like to start talking about culture and change as the two main words in here. But let's start thinking about change. So I think today when we think about change, we think a lot about big changes, disruptions, contrasting differences, and I blame it all. I really shouldn't, but like I think it has a lot to do with about the 90s. So I guess we all heard of the term disruptive innovation. So that's an economist called Clayton Christensen who came up with it in the 1997 and then really shaped a whole generation of ideas of change, as change has to be big, has to be bam, and it has to be different. And then that has a lot to do with our imaginary of change. That's how change is. And then change usually has to do with this idea of breaking away from stability, order, and routine. And then if it involves a particular vision of reality, we really wanted to bring a different vision of reality into the world. And it also implies a certain imagination of change worker as a corps of agents that just comes to the organizations and the societies, like trying to mold it and change it, and then all capable, powerful, and heroic who save the world. So often, I think, is this sort of change that ends up fading. So this idea that change is a one-time exceptional thing that happens to us. But if we look around, change really happens around us. So now it's spring in Denmark. It might not feel like it, but it is spring now. So, so if you look around, at least things are sprouting. So that's also a different kind of change, and probably that's the change that we're the most familiar with, and then but maybe less pronounced. Change is also a normal condition of life. So in this kind of change, it's prevalent and it's continuous. It's not exceptional. It happens all the time. We're constantly in the making. You've all heard about the story, how often our cells change. So it's the same me, but not the same me as 6 months ago. This is so old, I'm not going to talk about it. But, it's the same idea. And then this kind of change, a different mode of thinking about change is to think about nuances, subtleties, micro processes, and sometimes surprises and improvisations. And then that also involves a different idea of reality. So we talked about the disruptive change. That's more about shedding light, really trying to introduce a particular vision of reality. But if we look around the changes around us, there are very different pluralistic universe of realities around us happening between us. So, and then this also implies that the person or the people who are actually carrying out change are not necessarily the corps of agents as change workers, as researchers, designers, developers, but everyone that also being changed. So change also comes from within. So I would like to summarize this, or just introduce a quoted text from an American philosopher and psychologist called William James. This is probably his most quoted text. For the audience online, I'm not sure you can see it, so I'm just going to read it out loud. And then just to elaborate on what I meant by a pluralistic universe of reality. That sounds trippy. So let's just look into it. So what he actually talked about as a pluralistic universe, he talks about what really exists is not things made, but things in the making. Once made, they're dead, and an infinite number of alternative conceptual decompositions can be used in defining them. But put yourself in the making by a stroke of intuitive sympathy with the thing and the whole range of possible decompositions coming into your possession. You're no longer troubled with the question which of them is the more absolutely true. Reality falls in passing into conceptual analysis, in mountain living its own undivided life. It buds and burgeons, changes and creates. So what does this all mean? And if we think a little bit about the change workers and the context that we're working with, so I think sometimes the stress that we talk about, the failure of creating culture changes, is often about the failure of creating our own vision. And then perhaps it's also about there's a little bit of a neglect of not seeing other things around us. Maybe that is a bit harsh, but change does happen as in these interactions around us. And then there are things sometimes we don't see or we can't see through our own bubbles or lenses that we see through the world. So for today, I wanted to talk about change, especially organizational change, as a way of becoming. So here, I would like to emphasize this tension between change as disruption, between disruption and continuity, but emphasize more as change not only as disruption, but also continuity. It might be counterintuitive to think, well, change should be about differences. If things continue, what are the differences then? But here's the point, that change doesn't have to be about pronounced differences all the time. It can also be the continuity of things that are in the making all the time, and look at it that way. And in that sense, change is also continuous in the sense that it happens around us, but it happens scattered across different contexts and situations. So when we think about changes, then it's not about reinventing the wheel, reintroduce a reality to other people's realities that are already in. Rather, it's about reweaving that some of the existing beliefs, webs of beliefs, and the ways of habits or habits of actions, like through the interaction of new experiences. So it's more about reorganizing experiences and then in the hope of something new that comes out of there. And then Hella talked about hope yesterday. Like there's hope in creating culture change, and I think this is where probably hope can come from. That hope comes from actually trying to recognize these realities in passing, and then these in between spaces there. And then it's not just a compromise to say, well, it's because we did not create the big culture change. That's why we start to look at the smaller changes. It's not failure as such, but more like that is what we are engaging with, the change as a normal condition of life. But having said that, I also wanted to emphasize in this vision of organizational change as becoming, there is also a strong collective element in the sense that I would often like to think about it as two dimensions. So change doesn't only happen as in one person to another. So we are all living beings who live in a network of like human and things. So when we think about change, as we have thought about, it's often about the ways how we organize around us, organize our relationship with each other, our relationship with the cat, with the water, with the laptop, and everything else. So in that sense, change always happens collectively on the so-called object of change. But the object of change is also not stable, especially in relative to the subject of change. Let's forget about the object and change and the subject thing. So what I wanted to talk about is that we often think in this dichotomy of change makers and people are being changed. But that dichotomy is not always stable. So I actually, yesterday when I was like rehearsing this phonetically at home, and I really did. So I actually entered this conversation with my partner. And then he asked me, he's like, what do you mean by like this position is not stable? He is a software developer and he talks about, well, I adopt user's view. Isn't that enough? I think I'm doing what you're saying. I was just like, yeah, I think you're doing it. But there also comes a question of recognition. So I think the thing that is missing sometimes in my own work as well is this heroic idea of we're the change workers and we come to save the world. We understand the world and then we put things that people don't understand and then try to institutionalize a particular way of reality. But I also wanted to recognize that changes always happens both ways. As we try to transform other people, people also come and transform us. So in a way, change really is a sense of collective becoming. If we're talking about users, then we and users become a community and we try to figure out something together. So our role as a change maker perhaps is more like a coordinator, an in-cooperator, and trying to understand the context. We have certain roles and that's pretty much it. So in talking about collective becoming, it's also to think about, well, to get rid of this idea of change makers as the hero of the day. But you may still ask, okay, that's fine and dandy. That's your philosophy. Like, what does that have to do with anything of practice anyways? But I want to tell you a little bit of a story. So this beautiful image, this beautiful house is a newly, well, it was built about 10 years ago or 15. No, it's 19 years ago. Time flies. Sorry. So it was built in around 2013, maybe even earlier. So what happened was that, so this is a village. So this village locates in the north of China, on the border between China and Russia. You can't see it, but it's very close to a very thick, dense forest. And then in that forest lives in this indigenous group, a Renki group, and then that was the last. They're not the last nomadic groups who live a nomadic style in China, but they're the last nomadic group who actually live their life based on herding reindeers and hunting reindeers. So what they did for a very, very long period of time was that they hunt reindeers and then herd reindeer during winter. And because it's very cold to the north, so during winter time it's usually minus 40 degrees, and they stay in the forest for the whole winter to herd the reindeers. So what happened is that in the 1989, and then China introduced a very, very well-intended law, which is animal protection law. And then following that, so basically the hunters' guns are taken away and their licenses are taken away and they're not allowed to hunt reindeers anymore. And then plus the local government also thought it was a good idea because lots of the local herders, they kept dying during the winter times because in order to keep warm, some of them also drinks during the winter times, and then that led into either people died young or sometimes fell into rivers and then just died that way. So the local government thought that's not good enough. Let's create something really nice for people who with a roof, so they don't have to live in a cold areas like this. So what they did was that they actually collaborated, I think, with the Finnish government and then also a Finnish company to come up with an ecological village that really follows the local habits and then how they live, because they also live a little bit tribal, as in like a bigger family and so on and so forth. So created these really beautiful houses. If you search for it, you can still see like urban dwellers who would go as, oh my God, amazing Nordic architecture. Like, and then, it's really stunning. But then, so what happened was that once this village was introduced, in a couple of years, the death rate in the area actually has risen. So it really bothered a lot of people and they couldn't understand why. So now there's central heating, everything was well provided and they have subsidies. What could go wrong? So what happened was that basically this particular group of people, reindeer, especially herding reindeer, is such a big, it's very ingrained in their everyday way of life. And then taking that away drastically from their life really made an impact, because there is a huge void that's left in their everyday practices that they just didn't know what to fill in. So, but the alcohol is still there. So there's like an increasing consumption of alcohol, and then people kept on that track. So, I mean, of course, things are getting better, people adapt, and then gradually what happened is that a generation of people died out, a younger generation come up. So change does happen as such. But that's my point of saying that drastic change can happen, but when that happens, it also takes a great cost. Sometimes we don't need to see so many people dying or so many users like losing their habits. Perhaps there is a way of emphasizing continuity and then making it also relatively normal as a condition of life. So, and that's why this philosophy matters, just to say. So, but with that story, I also wanted to talk about the two different ways of change. So now we have talked about two different ideas of change that also kind of speaks to normatively the kind of like change approaches that we see in organizations today. And then one is governance and the other one is culture. So let me just say these two words are both very conceptually charged, depending on who you ask. So this is really a very broad stroke of normative idea of what it is. So please be fully aware that you might talk about it and people just not connect on what this is about. But overall, when we think about governance, really it speaks a lot to the first view of change. As something drastic, you have a particular vision, a strategic goal, whether as a society or in an organization as new CEOs who have a new strategy and you would really like to implement it and make sure everybody follows. So usually governance is approach that is actually involves a lot of top-down designs, so regulations, policies, procedures, so trickling down, thinking about that's how change should happen. And then change, like an instrument of change in this kind of context, it usually involves a particular framework. It's like, this is how you should behave. This is how you should follow. Instead of making decisions every day eclectically and then just following your intuitions, this person should make this decision in this context. It's a lot about control as well. So the effects of change, though, it does have positive effects, and then we are all products of that since we are in modern organizations, that people are empowered structurally, in the sense that you are put into a position to make decisions on certain kind of things that are designed there. So that's one approach of addressing change. But the other one, and this also probably, I think, the audiences, that the kind of change that you are aspiring to address as well, is actually culture. And then let's look at things a little bit more from bottom up. And then rather than thinking about there's the strategic goal, well, that is still there, but also about looking at the existing practices and the norms and values among groups of people, and then trying to actually initiate change by incorporating different practices and different contexts and so on and so forth. And then here, the change instruments is often like about sense-making, identification, social gathering like this. I think you're all very familiar with. And then the effects change is also like about creating a sense of recognition and identification. Does that sound familiar to your daily work? Vaguely? That's good. So, good. So, well, these added to the big chunks of like how we think about change and in terms of actually doing change, initiating change in our society, and this guy. So, I think how many of you have seen this line before? Excellent. So this is like the line that everybody goes and to say, well, culture is strategy, including governance for breakfast. So that's really great. Like, and then of course he's an Austrian and an American management consultant, very enabling. And then I would like to talk about this sentence, not just about how important culture is, but what happens after breakfast. I think the reason why we fail to create culture change is also that we only focus on breakfast, and then after that, during the day, we don't talk so much about what happens after culture is strategy for breakfast. And that has to do with the idea of culture. So I'm sure you're not strange to this line. It's cultural. Anything that happens in an organization among a user group that we can't understand, things that we wanted them to do and then people didn't do. Like now it seems that it all comes to this one sentence. It's cultural. But what does it actually mean? Any guesses from the audiences?
I guess that could be related to habits that the people perform already, right? It's like a daily basis habits becomes a more and more culture because it's contagious, right?
Yeah.
And it becomes something.
Yeah, absolutely. So definitely. So it has to do with how people behave, right? So, but there is a certain danger, not to your idea, that's wonderful, but to this line of is cultural, is that we also come to essentialize culture. And then when we think about things that are cultural, we also think about there is a thing called culture. Something exists. So there is a shared habit among a group of people. We need to understand, we need to find that essence, what defines them as a user group. How do mothers behave? Like, how do mothers behave at home in public space, for example? Like, we seem to be like really caught up with that idea. There's a group, and there's something that defines the characters of their behaviors. But here is the problem, is that the idea in itself is very fine, but the actual operation of the idea is difficult. So essentially, when we think about whether there are habits that define a group of people, what happens is that we're trying to identify sameness and differences. Sameness as in what happens, what is shared among a group of people, and differences as in what distinguishes one group of people from another. And again, it's all very logical, but if we think a little bit more about it, what do we mean by sameness and differences? On what dimensions are we thinking about sameness and differences? So with the audiences is here, we might share like a few traits in terms of like age, gender, educational background, and so on and so forth, and places we live. And then, but we also differ widely in a lot of different other places. So I think the idea of thinking that it's cultural really creates the illusion that we can actually grasp something. It's not to say that we can, but it creates a problem that requires us to constantly operationalize and define which dimension that we're engaging in. And those dimensions are also very elusive, because the more we look at it, the more it disappears. And then, so that brings me to another idea. And then maybe after this slide, you're going to go into a completely mode of despair. But just to say there's hope, I'll put things back. So Benedict Anderson is an American political scientist and then also a historian. So he had this really, really famous book published in 1983 called Imagined Communities, Reflections on the Origin and Spread of Nationalism. If I may just like summarize the book really quickly, please correct me if I did it wrong, is that his idea is to say that this idea of us, like I'm born Chinese, therefore I have a shared Chineseness with the Chinese people around me, is an imaginary. It's something that doesn't exist. So what does he mean by that? So he's often like, he's very much against this idea that if you're born, like one person is bound into a place and then a certain kind of like idea of how people are is bound into a particular physical space. And then what he meant is that, well, there's very little chance, for example, that I look at the crowd today, that there are probably no fellow Chinese for me. So there's very little chance that I can actually see a Chinese person, for example, international context. I see them like once in a while, but like there lacks the opportunity of direct interaction. So to be honest, there's no way of actually interacting and confirming that we are similar or different. But he said, well, there are different, in a way, technologies that are being deployed to actually help to sustain this connection or imagination. And if we think about it, he particularly talked about three things. So one is maps. And then here, this is where we connect it to governance as a framework. So map is like a governance of territory. So we try to imagine our connections to each other by relating to this governance of territory. We can relate to a map. So we're born, like if people are born here, the Danish, they can relate to the map. Yeah, that's where I live. And then he also talked about census, as in national census, like the idea of population. So here's my crowd, like I can see it, I can connect to it. And then he also talked about museum as a governance of history. So not only that we share a common space, but we also share time and a series of events. So three, this apparatus of governance of different aspects of nation. Then he argues that instead of actually creating a connection, but we are imagining that connections among each other. So I'm actually trying to say here is that, of course, we don't always work with nationalism, but we work with a lot of other isms. And then other isms also give us this illusion of connections, that we share a view. We share a view on certain things. We share other views. It's not to say that idea, as long as that connections, like we imagine it, they actually exist because we imagine it and then they come into being that way. But how can we actually creating culture change by actually poking on how people creating that connections? And then drawing on Anderson, what I would like to propose is actually to look at the governance of our everyday life. And then that could be a lot of things, but I wanted to particularly bring in a different concept. And that's, I think, a lot of you that are familiar with, you're probably also working with digital applications and digital solutions and so on and so forth. Is actually to think about technology, especially the digital technologies, as the governance of everyday life today. And then, so instead of thinking about it as maps, and then museums, and then and census, but technology is actually, if we take a step back and think about what actually connects maps, museums, and census, is that they are some sort of institutionalization of our relations with a certain crowd, a place, and a certain period of time. And then so does digital technology today. So social media, for example, that institutionalized also our ways of relating to each other, making it visible, kept shaping our ways of thinking, and we're shaping it, so it's of course mutual. So technology really has this property of adopting the materials out of the world, whether being it adopting the materials from the world into something, and then materializing our relations to the world through this way. So be it as an artifact or a digital application. Our social relations are constantly institutionalized through technologies. And especially with digital technology, what happens is that it really stabilizing our existing knowledge of the world. If we think about public services, digitalizing public services, a lot of the design and the interface, a lot of the consideration that we put in there is actually an instantiation of our understanding of how, for example, citizens relate to a service, so on and so forth. So in order to understand how people actually connect to a certain crowd, for me, one of the more effective ways of thinking about creating culture changes is looking at what do we use, the medium that we use for institutionalization, which is technology. Not only to think of it as, again, the heroic image of technology, but to think of it as a way of sense making. Since we are already working with it, then of course we are also making sense of our everyday life with it. And then trying to look at it from that point of view would actually creating a possibility to understand how our normal condition of life is being enacted and then shaped and then also changed eventually along the way. And the reason why it's important is also because it's prevalent and embodied. So it truly affects us. It's in us. It's everywhere. So there you might ask again, that's nice. Like, so what does that mean? It's like, it sounds really good. Can you give an example? So I wanted to talk a little bit about a current project that I'm doing right now. Just bear in mind, this is not finished. I don't even know the result. So it's not only like too soon to tell success and failure, whatever that means. And then and I also want to say that I actually am fond of failure in a way that I think they tell us more. Anyway, that's a personal ideology. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about my experiences now working with this field, strangely on financial technology, and trying to bring into sustainability thinking in financial technology startups and companies, the difficulties with it, and then what I have learned so far. And then hopefully that's going to shine a little bit light on what I have talked about today. So the project I'm working on is called Carrion FinTech. You might ask, like, what does these two things have anything to do with each other? So for the people who don't know, FinTech stands for financial technologies. So it goes very broad from either investment softwares to like banking softwares, so like a lot of things that you can think about. It could also be accounting, all this kind of stuff. So what we wanted to do is to actually think that has a lot to do with the idea of big change in this world. So, well, I guess we are all on the same page now. That is not looking good on the climate front. So I think so that's also what all the international governments are working toward. So the EU had an ambition, and with the other governments, that since economic activities, that's what's driving a lot of the climate issues that we're having right now. So we need to make sure that business will grow sustainable from the get-go. So from the startup, they should be sustainable. And then the way how to do it is unclear, but because we're so ingrained in financial activities today, and then as you may know, in public traded companies, you need to report your financial audit and then do financial auditing in order to show that you're following all the different kind of assets and you're doing well. So a lot of the government's idea is also to say that today the companies also need to report on how they do on, for example, environmental, sustainable, and governance risks. So that idea is all fine and dandy, but it really created challenges for startups, in particularly in industries that are not really directly related to energies. So first of all, when you're in an industry that's not related to energy, what it creates is that it's not your core operations, and then if you have never thought about it, then it's really difficult to rethink, reorganize the relations that you have with the world, basically. And then secondly, that especially for startups, it's even more difficult because if we think about bigger corporates like Maersk, Novo Nordisk, there is at least data capacities that they can try to use whatever they have, the existing capacities to focus on these things. But for startups, they are barely existing. And then they are really just trying to catch investors' attention. So there's really little capacities left in this company to focus on this. So we are trying to engage with that problem and to see what we can do. What we can do to help to solve this problem. And then I think I did the same pitch to a crowd of actually not only fintech startups but also small fintech companies. And then what I was thinking was this idea that I'm gonna sell this ideology. People are gonna come on board. And then what I got was that the first question that I got was that after I did this presentation, and then one of the person raised their hands and said, so can you create some sort of system that you just give us stars so we can go to the bank and then say, well, how green we are? And I was just like, oh no, that's like exactly the opposite that I would try to push. It's I don't want to do more greenwashing. It's not good. So how to solve that? But I think that question was also became an epiphany for me that this is like not everybody, but that's a way of thinking. That's a way of thinking in that world among the fintech companies. And then I realized, in terms of the idea of continuity, that they do think about like quantifying like numbers and so on and so forth. And then that also brought me to another idea to understand that, well, financial technology is a lot about quantifying information and actually passing it on. So then it becomes this idea that maybe we should do something with data, not because it's hot, because it's going to give us funding, but it's because, again, it's this idea of that it's through the technology, through data, as a digitalizing like like these organizations' operations. And then since this is already the way they're doing things, maybe we can try to unpack what they're doing and to see if we can initiate change by somehow going in the same flow as them, but then also trying to make modifications with them and to see if that can change. So what we have talked about, what we have done so far is really trying to understand how these organizations actually engage with data. And then bear in mind, I'm not saying that data is like everybody should look into it, but it really makes sense in this industry because that's how that's truly their oil, even though I don't like that idea. But I think, so yesterday our other keynote speaker talked about the concept of boundary object, and then in the same way that we are also trying to use data as a boundary object to understand how actually different stakeholders in this field are trying to understand data and engage with it differently. What is their continuous normal condition of engaging with data, trying to understand the context, but also use it a way to connect with individuals and organizations. And then the other property is, of course, not only to think of data as sense-making, but also think of data as a way of stabilizing and institutionalizing our understanding of these relations. So, of course, our idea is to, based on the idea of understanding the relations around data, and then trying to co-design the not only what kind of data they should give, formats, and so on and so forth, but then how they should organize data. Can we try to modify it a little bit and then or change their thinking about also governance, like what kind of decision-making role should be stabilized in this. So that's really our ideas in it. And I also had to say that in terms of this collective element, I have to admit that I really hope that my external partners are not watching this, but because it's going to be a little bit confessional. So I did go into the field, had a little bit of idea of Greta Thunberg, kind of ideas like, I'm going to save the world, and I'm going to change how people think. And then there's like this big evil idea of investors and then startups that do no good. So there was a hint of that. I tried to battle with that idea from the beginning and then stay open, but there was a little bit of that. But then once I started talking about it, I also really started to understand that I think people all, like we, in a way, living on the same earth, that we all want to make changes. But of course, our actions are also bounded by the lens that we are covered. So in a way, I actually started preaching this idea of making changes through financialization. I think to some of my colleagues, it's very strange that I'm saying it. They're just, what happened to you? But I also think this is a way, of course, you can argue that, oh no, your value is like, being eroded, or like you can think of, if you think of me as like a person who has stable values. But I also would like to say that our values do get transformed all the time when we engage with the group of people. And I think sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad, and then all we need to do is to recognize it and then reflect on it. I'm also in the process as well, just to say. So I think, just to summarize a little bit about the talk today, so I think when I think about the idea of co-design, like really I didn't even mention the word design a lot, but I talked a lot about making changes today. And I really think of design as a way of making changes. I think there's also a lot of different ideas of what design is, and then as broad as governance, culture, change, and so on and so forth. But I think at the core of it is the idea of change. And then when we think about change, that especially organizational change, that it has to do with individuals, organizations, and then the way how we design top-down changes and bottom-up changes, and then how we engage these mediums of change as well. So I always say that I don't give unsolicited advice, but I feel like I have to. at the end of this. So also just to summarize the talk a little bit. So again, this idea of creating culture change as a collective becoming, I think it starts with every individual acting as a change agent, including change workers as UX designers, for example, but also change agent as the people that we're trying to change. And it requires us to recognize change, not just change as a mode of disruption, but also a mode of continuity, and then really to think that without continuity, that drastic change can actually make damages. And it also requires us to reflect on the instrument of change, not only through governance and culture, but also technology as a medium of like institutionalizing our relationships with the world. And it also requires requires iterative processes. So it's very likely things are not going to go straight. And then things fall back all the time. And I personally don't see it as a failure, because I think it's just the way of being in this world. And then we are in flux, and then we shift from time to time. And then that's also why there are jobs. Because there are changes happens all the time, and then we need to engage with it all the time. And then really importantly, not to find excuses for failing at a particular kind of creating culture change, but to recognize that creating culture change is not a one-time solution. It's not a linear progress, and it's not an easy task. So applause to all of you who are working with culture changes out there. It's not an easy work, but I hope you're all gonna carry on with the hope. I hope you didn't feel inspired at this moment. So with that said, thank you very much for listening in. And if you want to contact me and hear more about this philosophy or hear more about the project, then you can contact me here. Thanks a lot.